Good morning, I'm Julian Reed and welcome to Today in Parliament.
Good morning everyone, I'm Janae Noel Ferguson. Welcome to another broadcast. Now Today in Parliament focuses on present legislation and we also take a look back at past debates.
Well, Janae, on the heels of a major parliamentary vote last week, Wednesday in the House of Assembly, members of the Senate are expected to receive those bills today for first reading. But in the House of Assembly, the mid-year budget is expected to be communicated today by Minister of Finance, Prime Minister the Right Honourable Perry Christie.
Yes, Julian, and later on in the show we'll recap that voting process in the House of Assembly. But it's already shaping up to be a very busy year in Parliament. Just 3 months in, parliamentarians have passed 2 resolutions to borrow over $50 million from the Inter-American Development Bank for a financial monitoring program and a citizen security program. Additionally, House of Assembly members passed amendments to the Hawkesbull Creek Agreement extending concessions for another 3 months. The Health and Safety bills and amendments to the Bail Act. All of those bills are also on their way to the Senate this morning for the first reading.
We're also waiting for the tabling of the National Health Insurance Bill that was recently released for public consultation, a bill that would elevate the College of the Bahamas to the University of the Bahamas, and a new bill on the Freedom of Information Act. There's also been some good news coming out of Parliament. For example, CLECO policyholders finally got an update that they should be expecting a payout soon. Today, however, we place attention on the mid-year budget, which covers a period from June of last year to December, when the 2015-16 budget was tabled, as I said, to December of last year. And what we really are expected to hear is how far we've come along in meeting some projections, or if we've encountered any challenges along the way. Additionally, if there may be a need for additional resources to be applied in certain areas.
That's right, Julian. The mid-year budget is also a timely one, as credit rating agency Moody's recently released a report on the Bahamas forecasting continued anemic growth for the foreseeable future. Now, the Bahamas did, however, maintain a stable outlook and its rating did not change. That report also noted, though, that since the last assessment in September 2015, economic growth has been weaker, pushing the peak in debt to GDP ratio back by a year and to a level higher than the one initially forecasted. Now, the report concluded that the higher debt burden will begin to weigh down on the credit rating of the country as long as there is underperformance in the economy.
That's right. Now, this year's mid-year budget communication will highlight the financial state of the country 1 year after the implementation of value-added tax. During his budget contribution at the end of May last year, the Prime Minister noted that the government is continuing with its multi-year fiscal consolidation plan, with the ultimate goal of securing the future for all Bahamians. The practice of presenting a mid-year budget started in 2007 under the former administration with a view to improving accountability of public finances.
That's right. Now, looking back at last year's budget, Prime Minister Perry Christie, he laid out the foundation for the National Health Insurance Scheme. Now, at that time, he revealed that it will undergo a phased-in approach with no additional taxes to be imposed to fund NHI at this time.
The Stronger Bahamas initiative was also announced. That was expected to include 3 pillars of focus, namely a safer Bahamas, a prosperous Bahamas, and a modern Bahamas.
That's right, Julian. And even though there was a record-breaking murder count last year of 149 murders, a safer Bahamas thrust was expected to be achieved through early intervention in education, accelerating progress on reform of the justice system, and enhancing the enforcement of laws and the protection of our communities.
A prosperous Bahamas centered on the diversified growth of the economy, broader and deeper foreign investment, enhanced employment opportunities, and higher standards of living.
And by building a modern Bahamas, it was expected that there would be a stronger and more effective educational standards for high school graduation, enhanced post-secondary education through the University of the Bahamas, as well as an improved, sustainable array of other social programs. Of course, it would be interesting to see where we are financially after the passage of Hurricane Joaquin last year that ripped through the islands of the Central and Southern Islands in last October. Now, the dollar value of the repairs estimated to be around in the millions.
Absolutely. Well, government officials have already indicated that rebuilding efforts have been slow due to lack of material and labor. Another issue is whether or not homes will be rebuilt in the same low-lying areas that were hit hard by that Category 4 hurricane.
And we know that government has been encouraging people to move to higher ground from areas where they found it to be necessary, but they've not forced anyone to move. Rebuilding roads in the same areas that were damaged, also a concern. Now, during a communication in Parliament last year, Prime Minister Perry Christie noted that it would cost millions more to elevate and move roads, and the government is considering its feasibility at this time.
Well, during last year's budget, there was also hope that Baha Mar would have been well opened by now.
That's right, Julian. But this was before the developer filed for bankruptcy, which started a whirlwind of controversy, court cases, failed opening dates, and ultimately job losses for thousands of Bahamians.
There were also plans for energy reform, and that was realized last year with the passage of the electricity bills, and earlier this year with the signing of a services management agreement for BEC, which is now Bahamas Power and Light, and is being managed by Power Secure International. That company, however, was recently sold.
That's right, Julian, it was. The government also announced a number of revenue measures to provide tax relief to all Bahamians. The Prime Minister said during the last budget communication that they were prepared to begin a payback to the Bahamian people, a portion of the dividends from a successful VAT regime.
Well, with that came a number of tax reductions. There was the elimination of duty on medical equipment and supplies, bicycles, burglar alarms, and audio and video equipment for churches.
Duty rates were also reduced on certain imports, including canned and frozen vegetables. The maximum rate of duty on motor vehicles was reduced from 85% to 65%. Taxi cab owners were also able to import duty-free vehicles up to 3 years old, as opposed to new cars only. A ban was, however, placed on the importation of wrecked vehicles more than 10 years old.
That's right, and a 2-year exemption on customs duties for building materials used to repair small homes and buildings was also proposed, and the extension of exemptions under the Family Island Development Encouragement Act by an additional year to include Abaco, all of Grand Bahama, Bimini, and Eleuthera. The City of Nassau Revitalization Act was also extended for another year.
And the 2015-2016 budget also included amendments to the Real Property Tax Act to give relief to homeowners and businesses, as well as strengthen compliance and enforcement. Now, there was a reduction in the top tax rates on owner-occupied residential properties with attached rental units. More pronounced property tax relief for pensioners in mid-value properties, the introduction of a 10% discount for residential property owners who pay their taxes early each year, and a harmonization in commercial property tax rates at a lower level of 0.75%.
There was also a reduction in the maximum rate for business license fees from 1.75% of their turnover to 1.5%. as well as reductions for agriculture and fisheries businesses and for independent fuel distributors to the Family Islands.
Now, during last year's budget, the Ministry of Social Services was also given a $500,000 increase in its allocation for grants to those less fortunate. The NHI plan was also revealed, with government indicating that it would not include any new taxes, and as we know, registration is currently underway for persons to receive their new NIB card, which will enable them to get their medical care. Get your card to get your care.
Absolutely. Well, we recently spoke with Minister of State for Finance, Golden Isles MP Michael Halkitis, who gave an update on the state of the economy.
I think we're moving in the right direction. You'll see that we have put the public finances in a better position. Of course, we are in a world where, it's a low growth environment globally. World economies are growing slowly, and every so often you hear either the IMF or the OECD revising downward rates of global growth. Having said that, and for the Bahamas, for example, our economy is forecasted to grow between 1.5% and 2% this year. Not a lot, but positive. And so within that, what we have to do is just make sure we get value for money, we spend our money wisely, we collect what's due to the government, and we operate within that environment. So we are optimistic. We always optimistic. We're in a low growth environment. We just have to continue to seek better ways to get value for money, eliminate waste, collect what's due to the government, and manage within the reality that we have. So I am optimistic. We just continue to work out. It's concerned, but I think that what we have to do is look at the bottom line. Your rating is based on your finances, and my position is that if our finances are solidified, have them in a better position, that should be the bottom line. Of course, if Bahama was contributing to the economy, that would have been a positive, but that's not the case. But we have to work within the confines of what we have. I think we'll be able to show that we have done some things in terms of our revenue administration, in terms of keeping a lid on expenses, and in terms of slowing the growth of our debt, that would show that we're managing prudently. So I think that's the bottom line. We all look hopefully for speedy resolution to Bahama, but until that comes, we have to work with what we have.
Expect a lowering?
I don't want to speculate. I hope not. We'll demonstrate that we don't think it's warranted. But some of those things are be a control. But I think we've done enough to show that we're making the strides in terms of the managing the public finances that would warrant not moving lower. All right. The formulation is that it goes in a consolidated fund. If you have more revenue, then you can meet your expenses, and then you don't have to borrow. We have in place a medium-term strategy, which is a multi-year plan that we have begun to see our deficits reduce, the amount of money that we have to borrow decrease, and eventually we want to see that go to zero. But it's a process, and so what will happen is the rate of the growth of the debt has begun to slow. Eventually, it will stop growing, and eventually it will start to go down. It's not a single year process. It's a multi-year process, and the discipline and the focus on it. And I'll be able to elaborate more on this. Of course, we're coming up to the mid-year budget, and we're going into the budget, the main budget. And we will be able to demonstrate the positive effects that it has had in terms of boosting the revenue, eliminating the need for us to borrow as much money. We have not reached to the point yet where we absolutely do not have to borrow, but we think, if we're disciplined, that can be somewhere very near into the future, where we actually begin to pay down. As it is now, we're slowing the growth, and eventually we want to stop it and pay down. The Prime Minister has put it very well, in that whenever we're doing these sorts of reforms that are very wide-ranging, that impact everybody, we have to take into account all of of course we're looking at the benefits, but we're looking at the repercussions as well. And so anything that we do, we have to be sure through consultation with stakeholders that our economy can support it. And we have spoken about a multi-year rollout of NHI, and we are committed to ensuring that whatever we do, whatever we provide to the people, that we have to be able to sustain it. So we cannot do something then your economy forces you to pull back. So the short is that whatever we roll out, we have to look at all of the circumstances, including our ability to pay, and that will dictate the pace at which it's rolled out.
While the Golden Isles MP Michael Alkidis also responding for seconding the budget last year, it was there that he detailed some of the government's financial projections and reductions on various customs duties.
Mr. Speaker, we saw the experience of some nations where VAT introduction went very seriously wrong, and where, as a consequence, the tax actually had to be rescinded, only to be reintroduced some months later in a modified and more suitable manner. We were determined to avoid the pitfalls experienced elsewhere for the very reason that, given the importance and magnitude of the change, fundamental change, that VAT represented in this country, we simply could not afford to get it wrong, Mr. Speaker. And so, of course, we celebrate the introduction of VAT, because we, along with our partners in the private sector, within the public service and outside the public service professionals, Mr. Speaker, it was a team effort, and we believe that we got it right, and we have to work on it to continue, to make sure that we continue to get it right, Mr. Speaker. But as we have said all along, modern governance in the Bahamas depends on an effective and efficient system of taxation that provides sufficient financial resources to support the public programs and services that Bahamians expect from their government, Mr. Speaker. If you're going to provide the level of services that the public requires, you must have money to do it. And that is why we introduced VAP, Mr. Speaker, because all along, beginning at least in 2002 with an official study by the IMF, another one in 2005, about a half a dozen more since then, we knew that the system was inadequate and needed to be changed. Mr. Speaker, the administrations knew it. That is why we introduced it, not for its own sake, but because it is an essential component of our plan to put the public finances in order, as well as provide a sustainable financial foundation for this administration's ambitious program of economic and social change for a better, and yes, Mr. Speaker, for a stronger Bahamas. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the Deputy Leader has accused us of putting forth overly optimistic projections for real growth of the economy. He is quoted as saying that our projections are meaningless. Mr. Speaker, I would simply remind honorable members that successive governments of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas have chosen to rely on the economic forecast for the Bahamas that is developed by the International Monetary Fund in the context of its periodic World Economic Outlook exercise, Mr. Speaker, that they publish, I believe they publish it around April, Mr. Speaker. The IMF is an objective observer of economic developments around the globe, Mr. Speaker. They're not giving optimistic objections because the PLP is in power, Mr. Speaker. The IMF is an objective observer of economic developments around the globe. Its views are closely followed by both the ratings agencies and international financial markets. And so, Mr. Speaker, building our near-term and medium-term projections on the basis of the IMF forecast for real and current dollar economic growth undergirds the credibility of our budget projections. We did not cook it up ourselves, Mr. Speaker. We used the established standard on which to base these projections. And so the government cannot be accused of skewing its growth forecast for the sake of presenting more favorable fiscal projections. And I should say, insert right here, Mr. Speaker, the IMF projects that the economy of the Bahamas will grow at 2.5% this year. We are projecting our revenue, Mr. Speaker, to grow at less than 2%. It's around 1.5%. So we are being conservative. It's not that our economy is growing at 2.5% and we project that our revenue will be up 5–10%. That would be overly optimistic and meaningless, Mr. Speaker. We are being very, very conservative in our projections, Mr. Speaker. I should also remind honorable members, Mr. Speaker, that the government is committed to its medium-term fiscal consolidation plan. The Minister of Finance reiterated that, and I believe him, Mr. Speaker. And as such, as we have done consistently in the past, we will continue to monitor developments, and we are prepared to implement any in-year and appropriate adjustments that we deem are necessary, Mr. Speaker. We're projecting 2.5% growth. That depends on a number of things. It depends on the price of oil. It depends on geopolitics. It depends on natural disasters. It depends on any number of things. We stand ready to make in-year adjustments as required, Mr. Speaker. Okay? And we make them as required. But, Mr. Speaker, I would reiterate a fantastic performance so far. Mr. Speaker, now that I believe I have cleared up the misconceptions about the budget fiscal framework, I would like to spend just a few moments reviewing some of the key fiscal achievements that we have successfully secured in the past 3 years. As the budget communication stressed, our achievement on the fiscal front have been impressive indeed. We said we would reduce the GFS deficit. Check. Deficit reached a peak of $539 million in 2012-2013, reflecting the fiscal structure that we inherited upon coming to office. In the fiscal year about to end, the deficit will stand at $198 million. That, Mr. Speaker, represents an improvement of $341 million. We have cut the deficit by over 63%, Mr. Speaker, and to really see the magnitude of that achievement, I invite all members and Bahamians, members of the public, to do a bit of research and find out the experience of other countries during the same time, Mr. Speaker. Then you will really get to see the magnitude of the achievement. We said we would eliminate the deficit on the recurrent balance, Mr. Speaker. And in 2012-2013, it stood at $308 million. That is the deficit just to run the government day to day, the recurrent deficit, everyday government expenses. We were spending $308 million in 2012-2013, $308 million more than we were taking in. In the fiscal year coming up, Mr. Speaker, we expect that to move into out of a deficit position into a surplus position of over $100 million, Mr. Speaker. We expect in this upcoming budget to have a recurrent surplus of $103 million, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, check, Mr. Speaker, check, Mr. Speaker. As we said, Mr. Speaker, we would implement tax reform as a means of enhancing the revenue yield of our tax system to levels more appropriate for modern governance and more in line with yields everywhere in the region. Check, Mr. Speaker. The recurrent revenue to GDP ratio will stand at 22.2% in 2015-2016 upcoming, up from a low of 16.4% recorded by the previous administration in 2009-2010, Mr. Speaker. If you're not collecting sufficient revenue to give the services that the Bahamian people require, you will continue to borrow money to fund it, you will continue to run deficits, you will continue to increase your national debt, Mr. Speaker. And I should say at this point, let me interject here because we're about to get into the debate, Mr. Speaker. And when we get into this debate, it's always a curious debate because some members opposite, they begin by accusing the government of spending too much money. You're spending, you're runaway spending, no control, out of control, spending. And then, not quite in the same breath, but very close, Mr. Speaker, they say, well, why you don't spend more here? I need more over here. You don't do this for my constituency, Mr. Speaker. All those things are needed, Mr. Speaker. All those things are needed, and we wish we could give everybody, all members, everything that they need for their constituency, Mr. Speaker. We wish we could do it all. And we wish we could do it all. But you cannot say, on the one hand, you run away spending, you're out of control, you're spending, and then on the next hand, you didn't put this here, you didn't do this, you promised me this. It's a balance, Mr. Speaker.
Well,
All opposition members had their say on the budget as well. Free National Movement leader and Killarney MP, Dr. Hubert Minnis, said that under an F&M administration, taxes on bread, basket items, and medication would be reversed.
Privileged to speak here today. I am ever mindful, Mr. Speaker, of my duty as leader of Her Majesty's loyal opposition, especially on important occasions such as this, the national budget debate, to address national issues that affect the lives of our Bahamians. And it's my duty, Mr. Speaker, it is a duty which I take very, very seriously. This debate, Mr. Speaker, provides me and my team, my colleagues, my F&M team, with the opportunity to address the many failures of this PLP government, to expose the PLP's unfulfilled promises, their empty words, and highlight their wasteful and reckless spending. I intend to show, Mr. Speaker, their failures, missteps, and shortcomings. But, Mr. Speaker, PLP failures are not all you will hear from me today. We will support any effort to create jobs, effort to reduce crime, all, Mr. Speaker, as we move to building a new and better Bahamas. Let me be very clear. I want to be very clear here today. We are not cheerleaders. And it is not our duty to give mindless praise. We will provide the people of our Bahamas with a choice, a clear and better choice. Simply put, the Bahamas deserves better. The FNM can do better, and we will do better. The Bahamian people do not just want talk of a stronger Bahamas, but they want a new and better Bahamas. Mr. Speaker, we expected in the Prime Minister's budget communication a blueprint for how this PLP administration will deal with the many economic and social problems that affect us. We expected them to provide their solution to the senseless killings that go on day after day within our society. We expected them, Mr. Speaker, to tell us how they would reduce the joblessness and hopelessness that every day confronts thousands and thousands of Bahamians. We expected them to explain how this PLP government would assist the poor and protect the middle class. But every day we see poverty rising and the middle class shrinking, Mr. Speaker. Instead, this PLP budget is feeding us a steady diet of promises and more promises. We Bahamians are tired of these empty and unkept promises. It is time, Mr. Speaker, for the Bahamian people to move from promises to action. Action is what we need, Mr. Speaker. The government's effort in reducing our deficit are commendable. But deficit reduction is only half the story. The national debt is still climbing. The deficit won't go down, but the national debt went up. In this very same budget, we are asked to increase our debt by borrowing another $182 million. The PLP government, Mr. Speaker, has failed to admit that the Bahamian economy did not grow at the rate of 2.3%, which they predicted. Instead, they are forced to reveal that the Bahamian economy grew only by 1% in 2014. What the PLP did not tell us, that they did not tell you, is that our economy must grow at a rate of 3 to 5% to accommodate the annual high school graduates and provide jobs for the already high number of unemployed. The PLP government continues to sing praises of the smoothness with which VAT was introduced. But the government has shown no appreciation for the pain and suffering, Mr. Speaker, inflicted by VAT on our poor. The pain and suffering inflicted by VAT on our pensioners, and the VAT burden inflicted on the middle class in our society. For the first time in the nation's history, and in the history of Parliament last year, a political party, this party, the FNM, voted against the national budget. This is what the FNM did then, and we in the FNM feel even stronger now that it was wrong of this PLP government to inflict pain on our poor, our pensioners, dispossessed, and on the middle class. Mr. Speaker, I cannot imagine how a PLP party born out of the struggles of the poor, and which for so many years survived on the backs of the poor, could now turn their back on them. How could you? How could this Christie administration be so mean as to put a VAT tax on a loaf of bread, a tin of corned beef, bread basket items that we in the F&M made duty-free, tax-free? It is a crying shame, Mr. Speaker, that the old-age pensioners struggling financially in their golden years are forced to pay back $7.50 on every $100 they receive monthly. Mr. Speaker, every single item which the F&M either exempted or reduced the customs duty on to help the poor is now VAT taxed by this heartless PLP government.
Well, at this point of the show, we'll take a look back at last week's passage of those 4 gender equality bills. Now, Bill 1 gives a child born outside the Bahamas to a non-Bahamian father and a Bahamian-born mother the right to the same automatic right to citizenship that a Bahamian man presently enjoyed. Now, the bill was passed unanimously by the 37 House members present. St. Anne's MP Hubert Chipman was absent as he was not feeling well. Now, a chorus of yes votes rang across the floor as each member's name was called.
That's right. Now, Marco City MP Greg Moss voted no on Bill 2. That bill seeks to allow Bahamian women who marry foreign men to allow them to secure the same access for their husbands as Bahamian citizenship that a Bahamian man has for his foreign spouse. Well, this bill also passed with 36 members voting yes.
Meanwhile, Bill 3, which allows an unwed Bahamian man to pass on his citizenship to his child through paternity testing, was also passed with 37 votes.
But Bamboo Town MP Renwood Wells and Marco City MP Greg Moss voted no to Bill 4, while Central Grand Bahama MP Nico Grant abstained. The bill still passed with 34 yes votes. Now, Moss argued that the bill, if not altered, would open the door for same-sex marriage. He highlighted a number of international cases.
Gaydon and Mendoza. This is a Court of Appeal decision out of England itself. Gaydon and Mendoza, 2004 All England Report 1162. In that place, the court found that the prohibition against discrimination on any basis such as sex included discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. And this is what was said. The enjoyment, Article 14 had said that the enjoyment of the rights and freedoms set forth in this convention shall be secured without discrimination on any grounds such as sex. On the basis of that, Lord Buxton held this. Shockingly, in my opinion, but this is what he held. This court bears the burden of having to construe the convention as a living instrument. And I'll come back to this in a minute. What we perceive as the meaning of these words today do not necessarily remain the meaning of the words going forward. But this court bears the burden of having to construe the convention as a living instrument. It has to ask itself whether discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation is excluded from the protection of Article 14, dealing with sex. Looking at that question in 2002, Lord Buxton says, it seems to me that there can only be one answer. Sexual orientation is now clearly recognized as an impermissible ground of discrimination based on the word sex. Further, those who want to have a forthright discussion should consider the House of Lords decision on appeal from Scotland and Shirley Pearson, governing body of Mayfield School, which was on sexual discrimination. And the House of Lords in that case based its decision that sex does not include sexual orientation on one section, Section 5.3 of the Sex Discrimination Act 1975, which we do not have in this country. And but for that section, would have, and indicated they would have upheld the decision of Baroness Hale in the Court of Appeal, but for that one section, which we do not have. And what Baroness Hale had said in the Court of Appeal is this: those who treat homosexuals of either sex less favorably than they treat heterosexuals do so because of their sex, not because they love man or woman, but because they are men who love men and women who love women. It is their own sex rather than the sex of their partners which is the problem. And on that basis, she equated sexual orientation with sex. That was overruled in the House of Lords on the basis, again, of Section 5.3 of the Sex Discrimination Act, which we do not have. Which, of course, leads lawyers and right-thinking people to realize that but for Section 5.3, which we don't have, sex would have included sexual discrimination in 2003 at the House of Lords level. Let's put it beyond discussion, though, Mr. Speaker. If you go to December of last year, December 2015, in Leanna White and Haley Vidikis versus Pepperdine University, the U.S. District Court Judge Dean Pregerson held expressly that sexual orientation discrimination is not a category distinct from sex or gender discrimination, simply on the basis of the word sex. This is what she said, to quote it: "This court, in its prior order, stated that the line between discrimination based on gender stereotyping and discrimination based on sexual orientation is blurry at best." This is just December of last year. After further briefing and argument, the court concludes that the distinction is illusory and artificial, and that sexual orientation discrimination is not a category distinct from sex or gender discrimination. Thus, claims of discrimination based on sexual orientation are covered, not as a category of independent claims separate from sex and gender stereotypes. Rather, claims of sexual orientation discrimination are gender stereotypes or sex discrimination claims. She equated both. This is the District Court in the United States, Federal District Court, last year. Simply put, continuing her quote, "The line between sex discrimination and sexual orientation discrimination is difficult to draw because the line does not exist, save as a lingering and faulty judicial construct." That is where the world is heading, Mr. Deputy. Similarly, the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission held in July of 2015 that discrimination against an individual because of that person's sexual orientation is discrimination because of sex, and therefore prohibited under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, just by including the word sex. In fact, on an international level, Mr. Deputy, and I'll come into the end of this, on an international level, that view goes back as far as 1992, when the United Nations Human Rights Committee held in a case called Thunen in Austria, that's communication number 88 of 1992, that, quote, "sex includes sexual orientation." At paragraph 8.7 of its communication, the United Nations Human Rights Committee stated as follows: "The committee confines itself to noting that in its view, the reference to sex in Article 2, paragraph 1 and 26 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is to be taken as including sexual orientation." All on the basis of just that word without a definition, or without a proviso to that word. The Bahamas is not a signatory to that convention, but that is the road down which we are being asked to be taken. Speaker, the question then arises, if it is not the intention to open the door to same-sex marriages, why not insert a simple proviso? And a simple proviso is easy to draft. It will only be that provided that notwithstanding anything contained in this Constitution, any written law, or the common law, no marriages shall be solemnized or recognized in the Bahamas except between a natural biological male and a natural biological female. If that is not the intention to open the door to judicial intervention, why not include the proviso? And the refusal to include the proviso does beg the conclusion that that is absolutely the intention. When we're talking about bills 1, 2, and 3, we're talking about citizenship. I've already explained my views on those bills, and that I will not support Bill 2 because it gives an entitlement to citizenship just by marrying Bahamians. But when we're talking about Bill 4, we're not talking about citizenship. We're talking about the clash between fundamental rights. We're not talking about even wanting to compel someone to hide themselves somewhere. We're talking about the religious fundamental right under our Constitution being on the same level as the fundamental right for freedom of expression and the fundamental right for freedom of speech. We're talking about them being at the same level, and we are acknowledging that there's a clash. And we're determining as a matter of public policy how to resolve that clash. And I'm making the point very openly and very, very strategically that throughout the world, putting that word sex includes the word sexual orientation and resolves that clash in favor of same-sex marriages. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member.
Well, the Marathon MP, Jerome Fitzgerald, refuted those assertions by the Marco City MP, and he assured members that Moss's concerns were taken very seriously by the government and were sent to noted attorney Michael J. Beloff, QC, who submitted that none of the bills give way for same-sex marriages in the Bahamas. Now, Fitzgerald maintained that laws that govern the government of the Bahamas cannot be changed or challenged by world courts, and he also explained why at birth could not be added to the bill.
Marriage is an institution or relationship deeply embedded in religious, and social culture of a country. It is deeply embedded in the relationship between two persons of the opposite sex. Mr. Speaker, the opposite sex. Mr. Speaker, close quote. Mr. Speaker. He goes on, I do not consider either case justifies the member for Marco City's concerns. First, neither case that he referred to, the English European Union cases, concerned the interpretation of the word sex, which premise, and I'm quoting, excited Mr. Moss' suggestion that you allow the courts to have the jurisdiction to interpret that, and as the courts are satisfied that the societal norms have changed, it will reinterpret that and will open the door to same-sex marriage and the rest. He's quoting from his Hansard. Secondly, neither case was concerned with the denial or claim to marry advance on the basis that such denial constituted discrimination on the ground or attributable to sexual orientation. Thirdly, each case was concerned not with same-sex marriage, that is between a man and a woman or a woman and a man, but marriages between a man and a woman only, the only issue being constituted a woman for the purposes of the marriage, which means that they had tried to change sex. It should be noted, incidentally, that transsexuals who wish to marry will be a small part of the population. Now, the final paragraph. I therefore consider that notwithstanding the well-known injunction to construe fundamental rights provisions in the Constitution with a generous interpretation, avoiding what has been called the austerity of tabulated legalism, suitable to give the individual the full measure of the fundamental rights and freedoms referred to. And he quotes the Minister of Home Affairs. Unless, and this is the critical part here, Mr. Deputy, unless and until, if ever, the Bahamian legislature choose to enact laws legitimizing same-sex marriages, such marriages will not be recognized as law in the Bahamas. And that's the end of it, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, we are inserting, Mr. Speaker, we are inserting behind sex, meaning male and female, the definition. That in and of itself, Mr. Speaker, really should help to support the concern that Marco City has. Because we are putting that in, we are not leaving any interpretation that sex means anything other than that. So you cannot define or interpret or whatever you want to do with male and female to come up with sexual orientation. That's the point. So in fact, Mr. Speaker, I would invite the member for Marco City to now understand and accept that, in fact, this insertion supports and helps his concern. And at this point, Mr. Speaker, I want to give thanks to the late Dr. Miles Monroe, Mr. Speaker. I want to give thanks to the late Dr. Miles Monroe because it was him and the group of lawyers he put together who came and made a meaningful, constructive contribution to this amendment and suggested that this be put in, Mr. Speaker. And we accepted it. Notwithstanding that in English law and in our law, sex is settled. We said, no, we can put it in anyhow, just for the concern that the member for Marco City brought up. We don't want anybody to then say, well, we ain't sure that might mean sexual orientation. No. Male or female, Mr. Speaker. So ironically, we dealt with that. I want to deal with this last issue, Mr. Speaker, and that's at birth, because the member brought up the issue at birth. Mr. Speaker, in our Constitution, in Article 15, we talk about the protection of the fundamental rights and freedoms, Mr. Speaker, and we talk about sex. That's the only place in the Constitution now the word sex is. And Mr. Speaker, this amendment which is suggested for this particular Article 26 that we're now doing, to say that male and female at birth, if we made that amendment, Mr. Speaker, we would then have to make the same amendment for sex in Article 15. We'd have to say that you're protected, your sex at birth, Mr. Speaker. Now, what is the challenge to that, Mr. Speaker? The challenge to that, Mr. Speaker, is that under our law, we protect persons before they're born. We protect fetuses. That's how all the abortion laws came about, Mr. Speaker, protecting somebody before they were born. So if we defined it at birth, we would then have to make the amendment to Article 15. That would then, we would inadvertently, Mr. Speaker, be legalizing abortion. That's what we'd be doing, because there would be no protection under the law for us to protect unborn fetuses, Mr. Speaker. So I just want to make sure, Mr. Speaker, that that point is understood. So, Mr. Speaker, at some point in the future, there may be an amendment here in Parliament.
Well, the House proceedings are about to begin. As we communicated earlier, parliamentarians are expected to begin debate, or a contribution will be heard, rather, from the Right Honorable Prime Minister Perry Christie on the mid-year budget debate. We now take you to live proceedings of the House of Assembly. Continue to watch until the end of that communication, until the closing of Parliament, and we'll be back with live interviews.
Concerned that the priest and the Levite both passed by on the other side and left the work to be done by the Good Samaritan, who is Jesus Christ. He's the Good Samaritan in the parable. And so there are some terms that are used to identify us, even as pastors. People say, well, he's a pastor, but he's not a good preacher. Or the other way around. He's not a good pastor, but he's a good preacher. And we have good policemen and good doctors and good lawyers, people that we would recommend for certain cases. And of course, we have parliamentarians too. How are you perceived? How are you perceived? As a good MP? That's the question for the morning. And the idea is that you have opportunity in a little more than a year to polish up your business and do damage control. The text for the morning is from St. Paul's letter to the Galatians. And let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all. Our theme for the next few sittings will be opportunity. Opportunity to do good. Let us pray. Gracious God and our Heavenly Father, accept our thanks for the mercies of the weekend and for the opportunity to come to this honorable house this morning and resume the business of this Commonwealth. For those who lead, O Lord, we lift a prayer. For all those who serve, we lift a prayer. And for those who only stand and wait for opportunities, we lift a prayer. Guide in all our constituencies and bless all our leaders. You know the perception that the people have of us all, but help us to improve our image by the grace of God. We thank you that you have given to your servant, the Honorable Speaker, the wisdom to protect the minority views and yet to give the rights to those in majority. We ask for your grace to be sufficient for us all today and bless our country. We humbly pray through Jesus Christ our Lord, who taught us to pray together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. The old preacher was asking the congregation to be more generous when the offering time came. And the deacon got up and said, "But Pastor, you always told us salvation is free. You say it's as free as the air we breathe and as the water in the river. So why are you always asking for money?" The pastor took off his glasses and put them back on and tried to adjust them a little bit, and then he said, "Brother Jones, you are right. Salvation is free. But if you want water in your kitchen, you've got to have pipes and other things, and you need a good plumber." Somebody has got to pay for the plumbing.
Amen.
God bless you. May you find the money to pay all your bills.
Good morning, honorable members.